Hey everyone, this is another video in my series on computer systems, and this one will be covering Module 8 on operating system security in your Operating Systems Internals and Design Principles book by William Stallings. And this topic is near and dear to my heart. I really enjoy security, so let's dive right in and get an idea of some of the basics of security. Now, this applies to operating systems, and it can apply to security in general. It can apply to network security, as well as system security. But of course, we're focused in this class on operating system security. So let's dive in and chat about some concepts there. So when we talk about system access threats, they fall into two general categories. We've got intruders and we've got malicious software, right? So we've got the hackers out there trying to do bad stuff to our systems. And we also have malicious software like malware, right? We're talking about viruses and worms, things like that. Now, when we talk about intruders, we have a few different classes and some different labels that you're going to hear. So we want to understand what the differences between these terms so that we know what's being talked about out there in the world. We have a masquerader, who is an individual who's not authorized to use the computer, but penetrates a system's access controls to exploit a legitimate user's account. Right, so if I can go into a system and as an attacker, if I can own someone's account, and so now I'm an unauthorized person pretending to be an authorized person, that makes me a masquerader. A misfeasor is a legitimate user who accesses data, programs, or resources to which I'm not authorized, right? Or who's authorized for such access but misuses the privileges. So maybe I work for a company and I'm authorized to access people's financial data. I'm authorized to access our users' credit card information, but then I go and sell it to someone, right? That's obviously something I'm not supposed to do. So I'm misusing my authority. I've got some access. I do have some authorized access to the system, but I'm either elevating my privileges, I'm trying to get access to resources that I'm not actually supposed to have access to, even though I have access to some resources, or I end up just misusing what I already have access to. We also have clandestine users. This is an individual who seizes supervisory control of the system and uses that control to evade auditing and access controls or to suppress audit collection. So if I manage to get into a system, again, either a system I'm actually authorized to use as a user or a system that I managed to crack into from the outside, and I figure out how to escalate my privileges to the point where I can clean up logs, for example, right? I can kind of cover my tracks. That makes me a clandestine user. I'm in there poking around doing things I'm not supposed to do, but I'm trying to do it very secretly and cover my tracks so I don't get discovered. Now, moving on to malicious software. These are programs that exploit vulnerabilities in computing systems. This is also referred to, as I mentioned before, this is malware. And we've got a couple different categories. We have parasitic malware, which are fragments of programs that can't exist independently of some actual application. These are viruses, logic bombs, or backdoors, right? I'm gonna get this parasitic malware into something that at least looks like an actual application, right? And it's going to run within that context. Now, independent malicious software are self-contained programs. They can be scheduled and run by the operating system all by themselves. And this is things like worms and bot programs. So now that we've talked very basically about some of the kinds of threats that we might face, let's talk a little teeny bit about countermeasures. Now, RFC 4949, the Internet Security Glossary, defines intrusion detection. And intrusion detection is one of the most basic system-based countermeasures that we can deal with. It's a security service that monitors and analyzes system events for the purpose of finding and providing real-time or near real-time warning of attempts to access system resources in an unauthorized manner. Basically, it's a program, right? It's a program or a set of programs. We're going to run it on our systems or just on a system that monitors our network and it's going to know how to look for suspicious stuff. So intrusion detection systems, and you'll see this abbreviated as IDSs all the time, can be classified as host-based or network-based. A host-based IDS monitors the characteristics of a single host and the events occurring within that host. Again, just looking for suspicious activity. And a network-based IDS monitors network traffic, right? So that's the only differentiator between those. Am I looking just on a host, or am I looking at the traffic across the network? But either way, intrusion detection is a really, really useful and powerful tool for security. Now, what IDS has involved in it, the components for IDS are sensors that collect data. The input for a sensor can be any part of a system that might contain evidence of an intrusion. Types of input to a sensor could include network packets, log files, system call traces. There are IDS systems that monitor the file system of a host for changes to important files, right? So if I have certain important files that I know are never supposed to be changed except by an admin, I can set up this database of what they look like. I can hash those things, and I can have a system. There's one called Tripwire that's really nice that kind of goes through and monitors things, and if it finds an unauthorized change, it's going to alert your system administrators right away. So if I'm going to go in as an admin and change one of those files, I need to remember to tell this service that that thing is changed and kind of rebuild the database that it compares against. But that is a really, really handy thing. If we configure that well, we can really protect ourselves really, really well from people who might be trying to set up backdoors and get control of our systems. We also have analyzers that receive input from one or more of the sensors or from other analyzers. This is responsible for determining if an intrusion has occurred. Right? So this can provide guidance about what actions to take as a result of the intrusion. And of course, we have to have a user interface. We have to let the user view output from the system or control the behavior. That could equate to a manager, director, or console component, right? We can have everything from really nice graphical interfaces that run on a centralized system and control a whole bunch of different things, to very simple command line tools where you just log in and open up a command line and control it that way. Now, let's talk authentication. In most computer security contexts, user authentication is the fundamental building block and primary line of defense. That RFC we talked about defines user authentication as the process of verifying an identity claimed by or for a system entity. So we've got two steps when we authenticate into a system. And we've done this before, right? Anytime you log into a web application, anytime you remotely log into a computer or a server somewhere, you're authenticating. The first thing we do is identification. I'm going to present some kind of identifier to the system. Usually we think of a username when we deal with that, right? When I go to log into my bank, I give it my username. That's my identification step. Then the verification step is presenting or generating authentication information that corroborates the binding between the entity and the identifier. And all that means is when I enter my password, that's something that only I should know. So when I present myself as here's my username, so this is who I'm claiming to be for the identification step, the verification step is where I enter my password, to verify that I am who I say I am. And actually, what we do see now more often than not, especially for things like financial institutions, is two-step verification. So I can identify myself with a username, enter my password. If that checks out, then the system will send a text message to the phone number that's tied to my username. Right, so this is another thing. We've dealt with something I know in the password. Now we're going to use something I have, which is my cell phone or my phone number. The bank sends a text message to my phone with a code that I then have a certain amount of time to enter in the next step of the verification process. So we've actually used something I know and something I have to have on me in order to do the verification step. This next slide, this means of authentication, this is exactly what I was just talking about. It could be something that the individual knows, like the password I mentioned, or a PIN at the ATM, something the individual possesses, right? Electronic key cards, smart cars, things like that. This is referred to as a token, and honestly, your cell phone number where you get that text message can count as that for two-step authentication. Now, another couple options are something the individual is. You've probably seen people who have computers where you swipe a fingerprint to open things up, and maybe you have to type your password and then verify with a fingerprint. So that's fingerprint, retina scans, facial recognition, or something the individual does. This is dynamic biometrics. This could include recognition by voice pattern, handwriting characteristics, and even typing rhythm. There are systems that will actually use the typing rhythm when you enter your password. It's going to make sure that the rhythm corresponds to your kind of standard rhythm when you type, and to do it that way. So in case somebody manages to steal your password, maybe that rhythm detection is actually going to catch that person out. Now, another term to be aware of is access control. This implements a security policy that specifies who or what can have access to each specific system resource and the type of access that is permitted in each instance. So this mediates between a user and system resources like applications, operating systems, firewalls, etc. Basically, what this tells us is what is someone actually allowed to do on the system. So once you've identified yourself and you've authenticated, you don't necessarily have complete control over every single system, right? You might, especially if you think about logging into a web application for your bank, right? Once you authenticate to that web application, you don't have unlimited rights to go looking at anyone else's financial information. You are very, very much restricted to only your own stuff. So in this case, a security administrator will maintain an authorization database that specifies what kind of access and to which resources is allowed for a user. So the access control function consults that database to determine whether to grant access. And what we really want to have happen is an auditing function that monitors and keeps a record of user accesses to system resources, because that can be a super handy thing for us to kind of figure out, hey, is someone doing something they're not supposed to do? And this is something that we can use some kind of intrusion detection system to keep an eye on for us and alert us if something happens that's just weird. And that could be as simple as, if we've got this authorization database, if a user accesses every time a user accesses a resource, our detection system can consult that database to make sure that this is something that user is allowed to access. And if not, that's when it would kick up an alert so that the administrators can get in there and see what's going on. Another option for keeping things safe are firewalls. What we want to do with firewalls, we got several design goals when we deal with a firewall. And a firewall is just something that kind of looks at the traffic coming into a system, decides what to let through and what it's going to block. So all traffic from inside to outside and vice versa has to pass through the firewall, right? So we can physically block all access to the local network except via the firewall. If we've got a host-based firewall, we can just make sure that that's set up so that no traffic whatsoever can get into the system until it's been passed through the firewall. Design goal 2, only authorized traffic as defined by the local security policy will be allowed to pass. There's all types of different firewalls. There's firewalls that we can look at sort of just like what IP address things are coming from, what ports the traffic's trying to go to, and block or allow things based on that. Or we can actually look at something called stateful firewalls that look at the entire history of a TCP connection and make sure that there's nothing hinky going on when we put all of these different connections together. And another design goal, the firewall itself has got to be immune to penetration. This implies the use of a hardened system with a secured operating system, right? We've got to make sure that no one can hack our firewall and start making changes and allowing their own malicious traffic through to our protected systems, right? If the firewall itself gets compromised, we might as well not have it at all. Now let's take a look at another kind of thing that we have to be aware of when we deal with operating systems, and that's something called a buffer overflow attack, also known as a buffer overrun. Now, this is defined in the NIST Glossary of Key Information Security Terms as a condition at an interface under which more input can be placed into a buffer or data holding area than the capacity allocated, overwriting other information. Now, this is one of the most prevalent and dangerous kinds of security tasks when we're talking about an operating system. Basically, can I actually go in and misuse an interface that's already there to do weird, bad things to a system? And the bad there could be anywhere from just crashing the system out to actually doing things like privilege escalation, where I end up getting access to things I'm not allowed to have access to. So let's take a look at some just really basic example of an overflow vulnerability in C code. So we've just got this tiny little thing. It's just a main, right? We're not going to complicate this too much. We're just going to compare two strings. We have one string. All right, string 1 is already set. Okay, and that's set to a value of start. And all we're trying to do is have the user supply another string, string 2, and we're going to compare the two strings, and if they're the same, we'll set the valid flag to valid and report that the two strings were the same. If not, we'll report what the strings are and that they're not the same. So if we take a look at several runs of this thing, the first run, if we just run the program and enter start, then okay, this is what's expected. String 1 is start, just like we expect it to be. String 2 that we've supplied is start as well. So when that gets compared, we see, yes, that's valid. Now, what happens if we enter evil input value? Notice that we've defined those strings to be 8 characters long, but we're entering more than 8 characters. So what happens there? Well, we'll see that string 2 is evil input value, which is pretty much what we expect, right? That's what we typed. But string 1 is now T value. How does that work? Well, we're seeing the buffer overflow in action. Notice that evil INPU is our 8 characters that the string 2 was defined as. So the leftover characters are the T value. That's what ended up, that overwrote the value start that was pre-stored in string 1. Oh, that's what we're talking about. Now, of course, that says, oh, that's not valid, so that's okay. The thing still worked the way it's supposed to. But what happens if we can figure out that this vulnerability is there and craft our input? I don't know, say, that start is the string I'm supposed to enter. And I want to make sure that I can get into this thing, that I can validate myself in this application. So what happens if I do something that's actually going to overwrite things in such a way that they match? And in that case, I can do bad input, bad input. Notice that bad input is 8 characters. So if I do that twice, string 2 is bad input, bad input. String 1 is bad input, but notice that when we do the string compare up in the code, we're only comparing 8 characters, right? That means that the first 8 characters of string 1, bad input, do in fact match the first 8 characters of string 2, which is, the whole thing is bad input, but those first 8 characters match. That's going to come out as being valid. So this is just, it's a somewhat contrived example. It's very simple, but this is what we're talking about. Allowing someone to write further than what's been allocated for their input can lead to all sorts of problems. And believe me, clever attackers can do all sorts of damage with this kind of vulnerability. So how do we exploit buffer overflow? Well, again, the attacker has to identify a buffer overflow vulnerability in some program, right? So they've got to figure out that there's one there, and you can do this by some fairly simple testing, right? There are ways for an attacker to test code to find out if there's a buffer overflow possibility with certain kinds of input. And then the attacker has to kind of figure out how that buffer is going to get stored in the process memory, and hence figure out the potential for corrupting adjacent memory locations and maybe altering the flow of execution of the program, because that's what they're trying to do. Right? They're trying to make the program behave in a way that it wasn't designed to behave. Now, there's several different ways we could defend against this. We have compile time defenses, and, well, we have actually a couple different things. Compile time defenses aimed to harden programs to resist attacks. We also have runtime defenses, which are there to detect and abort attacks in executing programs. So let's talk about compile time techniques. And these are things, it can be as simple as the choice of a programming language, right? We can use modern high-level programming languages that have a strong notion of variable typing, what constitutes permissible operations, right? So there can actually be built-in security into a lot of different languages. So that's a great thing to kind of research when you're deciding to do a project. You know, take a look for what languages could you use that do a lot of this for you. We want to use safe coding techniques, right? Inspect the code, rewrite unsafe code constructs. Make sure that you're both starting out with learning safe coding techniques and trying to apply them at the beginning. But then when you do code review, make sure that you're having your code reviewed by someone who also understands secure coding and can take a look at the security as opposed to simply the correctness of your code. Language extensions and the use of safe libraries. There's a lot of proposals to augment compilers to automatically insert range checks on pointer references, etc. There's something called libsafe that include additional checks to ensure that copy operations don't extend beyond local variable space in the stack frame, right? We can actually go ahead, if the language itself doesn't necessarily do this for us, we can use language extensions, and we can use libraries that improve our automated safety checking. And we can use stack protection mechanisms. Right, we can instrument the function entry and exit code to set up and then check the stack frame for any evidence of corruption. StackGuard is an example of something that'll do that for you. Moving on to runtime techniques, we can use executable address space protection, right, where we can block the execution of code on the stack on the assumption that executable code should only be found elsewhere in the address space. We can use address space randomization. Now, that's a runtime technique that can be used to thwart attacks by manipulating the location of key data structures in the address space so that attackers can't predict those things. We can also use guard pages, and that's where we place caps between the ranges of addresses used for each of the components of the address space. So these gaps are flagged as illegal addresses, and an attempt to access them results in the process of boarding. So this is just another way we kind of use the system to, as we go, if somebody tries to if something happens in the program, in the execution that's not supposed to happen, we can just drop the thing. We can cut it off and make sure that no more damage gets done. So that's a look at one of the code vulnerabilities that we have to worry about. But next in our whirlwind tour of security concerns is file system access control. This identifies a user to the system. Associated with each user can be a profile that specifies permissible operations and file accesses. So the operating system is going to enforce rules based on the user profile, or, as we'll see in the example on using Unix file access control, based on the properties set on the file itself. The database management system, though, has to control access to specific records or even portions of records. So a database management system decision for access depends not only on the user's identity, but also on the specific parts of the data being accessed and even on information already divulged to the user. So what we're often going to have are kind of three groups of things that we're going to focus on. We've got our users, right? So we can have all the different users that can be using a system. And we've got roles that we assign those users to. So I might have a couple users that have role 1, another user that's actually got role 2 and role 3, another one that's just in role 3, right? So we can have a combination. So we can have multiple users in a single role. We can have users that have multiple roles. or we can just have one-to-one where one user has a single role, and it's those roles that are given access to certain resources. So, what if I have a company and I designate that, okay, if you're in sales, then you get role 1 because you're a salesperson. And if you're in human resources, you're in role 2. And maybe a marketing person, or who knows, maybe some kind of internal equity officer might need access to several roles to take a look at someone's human resources record and also some other information about them, right? So those roles determine what access people get, and the users can be assigned to roles or removed from roles however often we need to make sure that only the appropriate people have access to the appropriate resources. Another method of using file access control is the Unix approach, where basically we just set properties on files. So we have bits that we set where we have what the owner of a file is allowed to do, what the group that they're a part of is allowed to do, and what anybody, the other class, that's what anybody on the system is allowed to do. In the example up at the top here, the owner can read or write a file. Right? The user who actually owns the thing can read or write to the file. Someone else in the same group can only read it, though. And everyone else can't do anything. Nobody else can even see that this thing's out there. So that's a traditional kind of file security, file access control that you're going to see in Unix. So let's take a look at just basically a set of steps that we go through when we want to harden an operating system. Right? When we get an operating system going, when we install it on a computer, and we want to secure this thing. We want to make it less susceptible to attackers being able to mess with us. We have some basic steps to secure an operating system. We're going to install and patch the operating system. That's very important. We always, as soon as we install, don't start putting your applications on. Patch that thing up. Apply updates and patches. We'll harden and configure the operating system to address the identified security needs by remove unnecessary services, applications, protocols. If I've got FTP running on the thing, but I never have to have anyone FTP into it, get rid of it. If Telnet's running, get rid of it. Only keep what I actually need. We're going to configure my users, groups, and permissions, right? I'm going to carefully figure out what groups need access to what resources and which users should be part of those groups. Get that in place. And I'm going to configure those resource controls. Next, we'll install and configure additional security controls. Okay, we're going to put our antivirus on. We're going to use some intrusion detection systems. We're going to configure our firewalls. And then we're going to test the security of the base OS to ensure that those steps have adequately addressed the security needs. And then I can go ahead and get my applications going. And what I really want to do after I install my applications and configure the system for production is to retest my security. Let's find out if those applications have added unacceptable security risks to the mix. So, operating system installation, our initial setup and patching. We just install the operating system, right? So we've hopefully all done that before. We just install the operating system like we normally would. Ideally, new systems should be constructed on a protected network. Let's not expose the system out to the whole wide world to begin with, because when I first install it, there's going to be vulnerabilities out of the box. So the initial installation should comprise the minimum necessary for the desired system with additional software packages only if they're required for the function of the system, right? So don't do any of those. A lot of operating systems have options like, oh, do you want us to install all this extra software for you? No, we don't. Keep it bare bones, and then we will decide what absolutely has to be on this system. We want to make sure that if possible, we secure the boot process. Right? We can use UEFI, we can use Safe Boot, we can use a lot of different things to keep the boot process secure. And we also want to be careful when we select and install the additional device driver codes, right? Because device drivers execute with full kernel privileges, and it's often supplied by a third party. So we want to make sure that we're getting those from very, very trusted parties, or maybe there's device drivers we can do without. right? When we bought computers, maybe we bought them in bulk and we got some extra stuff in them because we were able to save money, even if we got some devices in there that we don't actually need. Fine, disable them, rip them out. There's no need to install anything extra. Anything that we don't absolutely need for the proper running of our system for whatever it's intended for, let's just not put it on there to begin with. Now, removing unnecessary services, applications, and protocols kind of goes hand in hand with that. Right? We're not going to add anything we don't need, but odds are when we install the operating system, there's going to be some standard stuff on there. And if we don't need that, let's get rid of that too. Maybe, there's Game Center software. Again, there are ports open for things like FTP or Telnet or whatever. Let's get rid of them, right? Anything that's not necessary for the proper use of the system for its intended purpose, we're going to get rid of that, because the less we have to control, the less we have to keep an eye on, the better our security posture is going to be, because the last thing you need is to find out that your system got hacked because there's some flaw in some operating system version's calculator program or something. So if you don't need it, get it gone. When we configure users, groups, and authentication, we should consider, right in the system planning process, right before we ever put our hands on a computer or install an operating system, we want to figure out what are the categories of users that we're going to have on the system, what privileges are those users supposed to have, what types of information can each category access, and how and where they're going to be defined and authenticated, right? We restrict privileges to only those users that require them. And this is a concept called least privilege. What we want to keep things secure is every user on the system should have only enough access to do what they need to do on that system. This is why, and it gets frustrating. I understand. This is why in a lot of government agencies and various other places, people can't go out and browse the internet even on their break, right? From their work system. They're going to be locked down from going out and shopping on Amazon or something. That's because we want least privilege. If they have to have internet access, then they can only go to the sites that they absolutely have to go to do the job. Same thing when we're dealing with files or anything else, any kind of resources on a system. We want to configure things out so that users have only enough access to do what they need to do. Now, some other things that we want to do here are making sure that we only have the accounts that are required, right? If a user doesn't need access to the system at all, get the account gone. System accounts that manage services on the system need to be set so they can't be used for interactive logins. Passwords that are installed by default should be changed, right, to values that have the appropriate security, right? We want our passwords to be long enough and mixed enough with special characters and things like that to be secure. And any policy that applies to authentication credentials and to password security has to be configured, right? Let's get those requirements up and running and in place before we start adding our users and letting people use this thing. We want to configure our resource controls, right? Once we've defined our users and their groups, we got to set the appropriate permissions on the resources and the data to match that policy. That may be limiting what users can execute some programs, or which users can read or write data to some directory trees, or even just individual files. A lot of security hardening guides provide lists of recommended changes to default access configurations to improve security. So, do the research first, right? A lot of this comes down to planning things before we ever put our hands on a computer. It's very important, just like we do when we're writing software, right? When we're writing software, we want to design it first. Same thing with a system, an operating system, or a computer that we're setting up. Design the security first so that we know what we're doing and we have a plan in place, and we can rest assured that we've done as much as we can to keep ourselves safe. Now, our next step in our list from before is to install additional security controls. And this is all the stuff we've been talking about, right? Well, let's not rely on just what the operating system includes. Let's install some intrusion detection. Let's make sure that we've got an appropriate antivirus, right? Get those protections in place. Configure up your firewall. We want whitelist applications to limit the programs that can execute on the system to just those in an explicit list. So that's a handy thing to do, because if I've got that in place, if I know everything that's supposed to be able to execute on my system and I only allow stuff that I explicitly specify, then if somebody does manage to actually get another application onto my system, it's not going to be able to run. I've got another layer there to catch that. So even if somebody cracks in, gets something installed, hopefully with an explicit whitelist for applications, it won't actually be able to kick off and run and do more damage. Okay, so we've done all that stuff. We've designed things carefully, and we've set things up, and we've removed unnecessary stuff, and we've even installed additional security stuff. So I guess we're through that list now, but we're not quite through the list, because we don't count those things as done until we test them. We always need to test our system security. Okay, and this is the actual final process. The goal is to ensure that the previous security configuration steps are correctly implemented and to identify possible vulnerabilities that have to be corrected. Because just because we've done all that stuff doesn't mean we've done it completely right. Doesn't mean we haven't missed something. Doesn't mean while we've been doing all that stuff, it can be a little complicated and we might have just made some human error. We might just have made some mistakes. So let's get a checklist going, right? And you can find these in a lot of different security and hardening guides. There are programs that are specifically designed to review a system to make sure that it meets the basic security requirements. And we can make those organizationally. We can have our own, or we can get them from other parties. And we should always do this following the initial hardening of a system and then repeat it periodically as a part of our maintenance process. We don't want to just test the security once, figure, okay, I guess we're done, and forget about it. We should be performing maintenance on our systems, and we should be testing our security every time we do that. So security maintenance. What are we talking about when we talk about security maintenance? We've got the following steps. We're going to monitor and analyze log information, right? We're going to keep track of what's going on in our system and keep an eye on it to see if anything weird crops up that we got to look at. We want to perform regular backups, right? I do not want to lose all my data at some point. I need to keep that data secure, and part of doing that is replicating it and storing it securely somewhere, preferably off-site, right? I don't want it just on a different computer. I'd like to have it at a different physical location too. We need to be able to recover from security compromises, right? That's part of our maintenance cycle. If we have a compromise, and eventually everybody does, we need to be able to recover from that, get our security fixed up, get our data back to where it needs to be, hopefully without losing too much of it, and get things back running. We want to regularly test our system security. That's kind of what we were talking about on the last slide. Part of the security maintenance process is making sure that we regularly and hopefully as often as possible test our security posture. Let's make sure, because new vulnerabilities are coming out all the time. So we can use things like vulnerability scanners that actually get updated with all the latest and greatest threats and attacks out there that can go out and scan our systems for us and make sure that we might have been very secure last week and almost completely unsecure this week because of new vulnerabilities and new attacks that came out. So let's make sure we stay on top of those. We want to use appropriate software maintenance processes. We want to apply patches. We want to apply updates to critical software and monitor and revise configurations as we need to. Every time something changes, every time there's a new patch or a new update to the operating system or to some application we're using, we got to get in there and find out if this has opened up security holes on our systems. Now, we talked about logging. And logging is really important. A lot of people tend to be kind of aware that there are logs on their system, but they don't really pay much attention to them, and they don't really necessarily know what's going on with them. But effective logging helps to ensure that if there's a system breach or failure, the administrators can quickly and accurately identify what the heck happened and focus their recovery efforts. You can get this from the system, from the network, from applications. And this is something that you should plan for. Keep in mind that data is out there. It's really important. And we can generate significant volumes of information, so we got to make sure that there's sufficient space for them. We might even want to aggregate our logs, so we might want to have just a server or multiple servers that are dedicated to nothing but logs from a bunch of different systems. We can set up our systems to send our logs to remote servers so that we can keep it all in kind of one place and make sure that we've got the resources there. We should have some kind of automatic log rotation and archive system, right? So that we can manage the overall size of the logging information. And this is something where an aggregator can help as well. And we really want to do some kind of automated analysis, right? We want to have, as those logs come in, and whether it's on individual systems or you aggregate those logs to a single system, have something running that will scan those logs and alert you to unusual activity. There's all sorts of applications out there that can do this. One that I particularly like is called Graylog, and it's free. You can go out and play with it if you want. So, that's something where you can actually have something that as these logs come in, it's scanning the logs and looking for whatever you told it to look for as far as things that are going to make you worry about your security, so that you can get alerted much more quickly than just finding out when, you find out that your users of credit card information is out there for sale. And data backup and archive. Mentioned it before, but we want to perform regular backups of data because the integrity of the data is important too. That's part of security. We want our data to be available. We want it to be current, all right? We don't want to lose stuff. And we might, right? We might. If we're doing data backups and we back up every 3 days, if we have a problem, a system crash, something gets destroyed, just before the next backup, you might lose a couple days worth of data, but it's better than losing your entire history of data on that system. And things just go wrong with computers. Sometimes computers break. Sometimes hard disks just stop working. So we want to make sure that we back things up and retain copies of data over extended periods of time, whether that's months or years, to meet legal requirements, operational requirements, to just plain keep our users happy. Right? We've got to make sure that we've got a plan in place for data backup and archiving.